Welcome to Take 5, your 5-minute inspirational message from Solid Rock Drogheda. These Take 5s, we record them, each one released on a different day, but I know sometimes people get to listen to them on much later, maybe playing them on YouTube, or they're broadcast on radio stations, sometimes several days after they're first released. But today, the day that this Take 5 is being released, is 8th of February, and today is the day, back in 1878, whenever a Canadian engineer called Sir Sandford Fleming came up with an idea that is, if you traveled internationally, is one you probably take for granted, and that is the idea of time zones. Because up until then, there wasn't standardized time in different countries. And so very often a town would set its own time zone and arrange what time the clocks would run at. Now, obviously, everybody wanted it that when it gets light in the morning, it is morning, and when it gets dark, it is night. And so the time zones were basically based around when it got light and when it got dark. But there was no standardization to it, which could be tremendously confusing. I mean, you could walk a few miles from one town to another and not have a clue what time it was. And so whenever he invented the idea of time zones, everyone immediately thought this is a fantastic idea. And it was basically based on the lines of longitude. If you look at the Earth as a globe, of course, and you watch the lines that run from the North Pole to the South Pole, those are your lines of longitude. And every 15 degrees would be a different time zone, which together would encompass the sphere of the Earth. Now, one thing, now they can still be a bit weird, these time zones. You know, I remember a few years ago, I was in Russia, and I was up quite north in Russia, up towards the Arctic Circle, and I was flying west to Moscow, sort of southwest, and I was in the air for 4 hours, but I went through 4 different time zones. So that really blew my mind a little bit, because I got on the plane, we took off at 9 o'clock in the morning, we flew for 4 hours, and I got off the plane at 9 o'clock in the morning. And that just seems sort of weird. And I guess it's because time zones, if you think they're lines of longitude, therefore it means that they get closer together because they run from the North Pole. They all meet at the North Pole, they all meet at the South Pole. And so your lines of longitude are further apart. So your time zones are much wider at the equator than they are when you get further north or further south. In fact, if you were to go to the North Pole, just think about this for a moment. If you were to go to the North Pole and stand directly on the North Pole, what time zone are you in? Well, if you're directly on the North Pole, you wouldn't be in any time zone at all, because all of the time zones meet together at the North Pole. So actually, officially, it wouldn't be any time whatsoever. There's no time that is measured on the North Pole. Isn't that weird? And as well as that, because the Earth is rotating on its axis, the whole thing of getting day and night, basically on the North Pole, it gets dark once a year and it gets light. There's only one dawn and there's only one sunset. And sunset lasts about 3 weeks. And then there's a winter that lasts for just pure darkness for months. And then it takes about another 3 weeks for the sun to rise. And then you have months of, well, I was going to say sunlight, but you're at the North Pole. So daylight, I guess, is the best that you could probably describe it. So time is weird indeed. And that's why it should not surprise us that if even time as men can measure it is weird, it should not surprise us that God's time is different from ours. God is eternal. God is not bound by time at all. God is simultaneously in the past, the present, and the future. That's why he sees the end from the beginning. And God is not subject to our notions of time whatsoever. I don't know about you, but I find that quite hard to comprehend. Therefore, we should not be surprised that God's timing for how he does things and how he moves in our lives does not sometimes be the way we want time to be measured. The Bible famously says that one day is like 1,000 years with the Lord, and 1,000 years is like one day, which can be frustrating if you're praying for something, you want it now, and it seems like it's 1,000 years until it gets fulfilled. But here's the wonderful thing. While God's timing is different from ours, you know what that means? It means God is never late. God is always on time. Everything that God does, his timing is perfect. because he lives in eternity outside of time itself. There's times in my life when I'm impatient. There's times when I want God to run on my time, and I need to learn to live on God's time. I pray that God will help you to do that today, to walk before him in obedience and patience in Jesus' name. God bless you. Join us again tomorrow by our time on Take 5, your 5-minute inspirational message from Solid Rock Drogheda.